The April 1st, 2012 interview would begin with Keyes coming face to face with Detective Monique Dole. Dole was the same detective who Keyes had wanted to confess to, and now she was present. He would tell Dole and other people in the room that what he was about to share was graphic. Furthermore, he wasn't open to hearing any details being leaked to the media. By this stage, Keyes had already given police the location of Koenig's dismembered remains, and a dive team was currently working to recover Samantha. However, because Keyes wanted to be kept out of the limelight, many people were left in the dark, confused as to whether or not the case was progressing. As a result of Keyes and his demands, investigators working the case were being bashed for not sharing new developments with the public. Having heard Keyes' concerns, Detective Monique Dole would take lead of the interrogation. She'd ask Keyes different questions about Samantha's abduction, and Keyes sounded eager to answer. For the most part, everyone else present in the room stayed silent. Keyes began describing the events that happened following him returning to his shed, having just used Samantha Koenig's debit card. He told investigators that there wasn't much room in the shed because sliding cabinets took up most of the space. Israel had positioned a foam mat onto the tarp in his shed, along with a fleeced sleeping bag and a radio. These items had been placed in the shed about a day or two prior to Samantha's abduction. Clearly, Keyes had murder on his mind as he'd pre-planned an abduction and murder location. According to Keyes, Samantha was sitting at the back of the shed on a 5-gallon bucket. Behind her stood a small shelf that was supported by a closet shelf support. It was pitch black in the shed, and Keyes wore a headlamp, which was the only light source. Either there was no lighting set up in his shed, or this was simply a tactic to instill maximum amounts of terror in Samantha because Keyes had a radio playing loud music. Obviously, that would indicate that somebody was inside. It's a small detail, but it just goes to show you the type of sadistic person that Israel Keyes was, wanting to savour every minute of fear that presented itself. Keyes had a piece of rope around Samantha's neck, which was screwed into the wall. She couldn't move, let alone escape. Still cooperative, Keyes would continue to allow Samantha to smoke throughout the early morning hours, whilst the radio played fairly loudly in the shed. If Samantha had begun screaming, her cries would have been drowned out by the noise. According to Keyes, Samantha never tried to alert neighbours by screaming. Israel recapped Samantha's abduction and shared new details which he'd missed out on revealing in the previous interrogation. Detective Monique Dole asked him why he'd chosen to park in the parking lot of Home Depot and IHOP, marked with the red arrow. Common Grounds, marked with the red square, is just across the street, with the neighbourhood behind it being better suited for an abduction. The neighbourhood was darker, had less traffic going through it, and Keyes could have avoided walking Samantha down a busy road. Tragically, the busyness of Tudor Road and Anchorage as a whole, plus Keyes' bold strategy, actually benefited him during his abduction. From 2007 to 2012, Anchorage's population was increasing, and as more people are crammed into a city, when a crime like this takes place, there are going to be more suspects. YouTuber Traplaw Ross mentioned the idea of urbanisation in his King Von Rap's first serial killer video. Simply put, if there's a higher concentration of people in an urban area, solving crime is made much more difficult. And as Keyes walked Samantha back to his truck, he would have known this. He passed multiple people on the sidewalk and nobody bat an eye. Nobody reported seeing anything unusual, and everyone who caught a glimpse of Keyes and Samantha would have just assumed that they were a couple. He was hiding in plain sight rather than sticking to the shadows like he'd done in the past. Keyes said that he didn't know why he parked in the parking lot before going on to say that he didn't think that the video cameras were all that good. The IHOP camera looked about 20 years old and probably wasn't working. However, Keyes further elaborated that the video cameras weren't a deterrent or much of a concern for him. He'd taken steps to ensure that nothing would be traced back to him should he be recorded on video. His face was covered, as was the front license plate of his truck. Keyes was fully aware that his Chevy truck was the most common truck in Anchorage, and he took full advantage of this detail. By modifying the appearance, like removing the rack, he could avoid being tied into Samantha's abduction. Moreover, his truck's back license plate was hidden with snow, much like with his Azle bank robbery when he covered his Kia rental license plate with mud. Going back to the original question, Keyes then further explained that there was too much snow about and few places to park up. He was worried about a random person accidentally hitting his truck during an abduction or potentially receiving a traffic ticket. Another detail that would come up in this interrogation was text messages. Keyes would be questioned about texts that he'd sent to Samantha's boyfriend and father. His thinking was that a girl of Samantha's age sending messages about having had a bad day and being pissed off was normal. The police wouldn't be interested or investigate for at least a few days. By that point, crucial time would have been wasted. Keyes was ultimately proven right. Keyes went inside his girlfriend's house and grabbed a glass of wine, plus some water for Samantha. Keyes had a love for wine and he'd made trips to different places like Healdsburg, California and different parts of Washington state, each known for their wine country. Samantha was given water and because she was justifiably nervous, she kept asking Keyes to turn up the heat in the shed. It was very warm by now. Samantha asked Keyes some questions about the ransom. She wanted to know if everything was going as planned. Keyes kept the conversation short and proceeded to unscrew the rope from the shed wall and cut the ties from Samantha's hands, still deciding to leave some on her wrists. He then explained how he tied Samantha up with different ropes, using different knots. Judging by his knowledge of these different knots, it isn't a stretch to surmise that Keyes had a ritual. This involved tying up victims with rope and binding them with cable ties. His confidence with this type of bondage demonstrated previous experience. Keyes left Samantha tied in the shed and went back into his house. By this stage of the confession, it is painful to listen to. Furthermore, Keyes' voice gets real low and quiet at times. You could tell that he was reliving the crime, as he described chilling details without showing any remorse. In his bedroom, Kimberly was still awake, but Keyes obtained a purple silk handkerchief to be used as a gag on Samantha. Alongside the purple silk handkerchief, Keyes had a 3B Leatherman knife that was really sharp. He cut Samantha's clothes off and bagged up her belongings into a large contractor's trash bag. Anything that touched Samantha was thrown into the bag. Clothes still on, Keyes stood up and watched Samantha for a while. She was shaking as Keyes stood staring at her in the darkness. Following this horrific sexual assault, Keyes made the comment that he felt as though Samantha was resigned at this point. She began asking Keyes if he was going to kill her, and he didn't say anything. Keyes knew that Samantha was never going to live once he had taken her to his shed. In a similar play of events to Lorraine Currier's 2011 murder, Keyes put on leather gloves. By that stage, his Leatherman knife was laying on the floor, having fallen out of Keyes' pocket whilst he was undressing. Keyes picked it up before jumping onto Samantha. The cable tie around Koenig's neck was pulled tighter and Keyes mentioned that she never made a sound. As Samantha slowly asphyxiated, Keyes stabbed her with his Leatherman knife. Keyes said that the stab wound wasn't deep and that his intent wasn't to kill her with the knife. After a couple of minutes, Keyes made the comment that there was still life in Samantha. He tied a piece of rope to the cable tie and hung Samantha off the small shelf support. Then, Keyes finished his wine, put his pants back on and went back into the house to take a shower. Immediately following the shower, Keyes woke up his child and fed his dogs. He ran back out to the shed and rolled Samantha into the tarp. After this, he opened up the lower cabinets and hid Samantha's body in there. Shutting the cabinets, he cleaned up the shed and unplugged the heaters and radio. On exiting the shed, he double locked it and called for a cab to the airport. Keyes even made a joke about the possibility of someone breaking into the shed to steal his tools. Whilst in Houston, he told someone he knew to park in front of the shed to prevent a break-in. Keyes began laughing when he thought of the possibility of a burglar stumbling upon Koenig's body. Keyes went from describing Samantha's murder to describing his morning routine without any emotion being shown. He was a partner and father now, and this sudden transition was one of the most chilling parts of the interrogation. I know that he was a serial killer, but just hearing such a lack of concern over the death of a young woman was troubling to say the least. Evidently, this two-sided ability made Keyes a very successful murderer. This disturbing murder confession ended, but Keyes still had Koenig's body stashed in his shed. He didn't have time to get rid of Samantha's body because now he had other priorities. Israel was to go on a cruise out of New Orleans.